So today I'm actually really excited to have Amy Oliver here. And just a quick note before I get to her professional accomplishments is I know throughout this lecture series you've heard a lot about how people make connections and whatnot and sort of how they come back in their future. Amy and I met when we were 9 years old, and we were munchkins in the Promise Valley Playhouse production of Wizard of Oz, which was a professional theater in Salt Lake City. So it was probably one of our first paid jobs. And so is it on your resume? No, just kidding. And the thing that's interesting is, so Amy and our paths would cross just randomly throughout our entire lives. And so in college, you know, like I think in high school we ran into each other at debate tournaments. In college we would run into each other while we were working on different political campaigns. And then her path crossed with my husband's path. And then the last time I ran into her was a couple years ago when a good friend of ours was sworn in for the Utah State Supreme Court. And so it's a connection that we've always had, and it's just sort of our paths cross. So there's something to think in mind when you hear the people talk in the lecture about this. It actually does happen. So on to Amy's professional life. Amy is currently a trial counsel with the Division of Enforcement for the SEC in the Salt Lake Regional Office. Prior to joining the SEC, she was in the United States Attorney's Office in the District of Utah, and she was there for 9 years, and that's where she started her career in government service. Before that, she worked in big law firms, and she was at Perkins Coie in Phoenix, Arizona for a short time, and then Latham Watkins in Washington, D.C. Amy is a graduate of Harvard Law School and a poli-sci graduate of the University of Utah, and I'm excited that she has taken some of her time to be here with us today, and you can hear from her. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Kelly. So I'm going to wander a little bit because I find podiums are a little formal and more of a barrier than anything, it seems to me, when speaking. So I'm really excited to be here. You know, I went to that university up north, so I haven't actually been down here on campus since I was a college student. I came down for a basketball game, I think was the last time I was here. So it's been really fun to be on campus and kind of, you know, see what things are like here down at the Y, and a good excuse to come down for me. So what I wanted to do is start off with just a little bit of background about me and about my training and kind of where it led me career-wise. And I will tell you right up front that I did not have a grand plan. I did not have a goal in mind. This is where I'm going to be at these points in my life, because I couldn't have told you at any point where I was going to be 5 years later, or when I was in college, even what I was you know, going to be after I graduated. So one message I want to get across is that you don't have to have the perfect plan. You don't have to have the goal in mind of the one place you're going to be, because I think there's a lot to be said for flexibility and taking opportunities that present themselves. And that's a lot of what has happened in my career. So as Kelly mentioned, I went to the University of Utah and I majored in political science. I also have a minor in history. And so I often got a lot of questions, what is it you're going to do with your life? Because you can't do anything with those. Because it's not accounting and it's not chemistry, you know, it's not something that anybody viewed as leading to a direct job. But my philosophy on it was very interesting. It was something I was engaged in, something I enjoyed doing, and I was more interested in an education as a process than as an end goal, right? So I looked at my training in political science and in critical thinking and in analysis as a tool and a skill that I would use later. I didn't look at it as you might in accounting, which was I need to be able to do these specific things so that I can graduate and get a job doing these specific things. If you're an accountant, that's great. I'm not making fun of accountants. We actually work with accountants quite a bit in my current job, and they're great. So I did political science and history, and I graduated actually a little early. I was on a fast track, which is interesting because I didn't know where I was going when I got off the track. But after graduating, I took a job at the Utah Supreme Court. So I was always interested in the law and legal things, but I was like, I don't think I want to be a lawyer. So I took a job at the Utah Supreme Court in their library. They had a law library in the state capitol grounds. So what we did is we worked with the state legislators who needed to come in and look at resource material for the session. We would work with lawyers who were using the library just for their practice of law. And keep in mind, this is a ways back in time, so there weren't as many computer resources available, and people actually used books. But it was a really interesting job because I got to see more of the day-to-day of what people do with a law degree, what they do in making legislation, and what the court did. So because we were the library for the court, we were their resource and provided the things that they needed. I also got to work with their law clerks, who were recent law graduates from all over the country who had come to clerk for the justices. And we worked a lot with the law clerks, who were really interesting people. And so I would talk to them about, well, why did you go to law school? What are you going to do? And things along those lines, because I didn't know any lawyers. There were no lawyers in my family. I didn't know any lawyers, so I didn't have a real good idea of what lawyers did. But it was during that year that I thought, what I enjoy doing is, reading about things, being analytical about subjects, really formulating arguments, and this probably goes back to my days in debate, right? That's what I enjoyed. So I thought maybe I will go to law school because I have to figure out something, right? And so I decided to apply to law school and ended up being very lucky to get into Harvard. I had never been to Boston, loaded up the U-Haul and hit the road, and I saw this commercial the other day, and somebody had an atlas, and the person commented how funny it was that they used to print Google Maps. And I laughed because that's how I moved across the country, was I had an atlas, and when we crossed over, we'd turn the page. Okay, I left Wyoming, where's Nebraska? Let's get to the next page. It sort of brings you back to reality when you think that you were so old they didn't have Google Maps. But anyway, I moved to Boston, and law school for me was just a really wonderful experience. So Harvard is a big law school, as law schools go, compared to a university like the U or the Y. It's not very big. And I had classmates who had gone to these small, tiny liberal arts colleges that had, 100 people in the entire college. So for them, the law school was really big. For me, it seemed tiny compared to all the classes I took at the university. But it was so interesting to me to meet the people there, right? So you go into law school and you think, oh, this is great. I got into Harvard. I must be really smart. I'm this awesome person. And you get there, the first person I met was like, yeah, I just got off the Peace Corps for 3 years, and I helped build this water reclamation project in Africa. And I was like, yeah, I've done nothing, right? So I haven't saved anybody's life. I haven't brought water to an entire nation. And I was like, okay, and I'm from Utah, and so people there were like, is that one of those square states, by California? And I was like, well, if you mean by California, you mean the western half of the United States, then yes, but there's a whole state in between us. It's called Nevada, and they would be like, oh, Nevada. And I'm like, no, Nevada. And it was really interesting just to meet people there and to sort of start to understand, because I'd always lived in Utah my whole life, and to understand the different experiences and viewpoints that people were bringing to law school, right? And we had a full spectrum of people there. We had a rabbi from Chicago who was in my class. He was fascinating, so interesting to talk to. We had people who had worked on Wall Street. We had people who had come straight up from college. We had people who had taken a year or two, like I had, in between and done something that sounded kind of interesting, perhaps, or maybe not so interesting. Just a real broad spectrum of people. And I remember my first year, I got in a study group of people, and we were such an interesting bunch. So you've got me from Utah. You have my friend who's from Princeton, who was from Staten Island. We have another friend who was from Notre Dame, and he'd grown up in rural Indiana. We have another woman who was from New York. We have a guy from Arkansas who had a master's degree in music and guitar playing, right? And we were a study group, and we really had nothing in common, which is so interesting. We would have these wonderful discussions about anything. You name a topic, and we would have these crazy discussions because the world is so different. when you grow up and spend your time in Staten Island versus Salt Lake City versus Arkansas. It just was such an eye-opening experience for me to hear from these other people and to talk to them and to learn their viewpoints. And I will tell you, we certainly did not agree on a lot of things, and there were several topics that we concluded we would just agree to disagree because we still wanted to be friends. But it was a really eye-opening experience in law school to meet the people. And I'll do some name dropping now. So I have a couple of famous classmates, which usually just kind of makes you feel bad about yourself because you're not as awesome as they are or you haven't achieved what they have. So I don't know if any of you know the Castro Brothers, so Julian and Joaquin, one of which is the former mayor of San Antonio and is the current Secretary of Transportation under Obama. And his twin brother is the current congressman from the San Antonio area. So these guys were in law school, and they're a wonderful story. They're sons of immigrants, and their parents, came to the United States to give their children a better life, and they went to Stanford, and then they came to Harvard. But they're the funniest guys. They're identical twins. I mean, identical. So nobody can tell them apart. And they play practical jokes like no end with each other. They even, afterwards, after graduate law school and everything, they did the parade in San Antonio, and nobody knew which brother was in the float because they couldn't tell them apart, and they were such known practical jokers. It was a huge media event. Is that Joaquin? Is that Julian? Like, who is it? So this year, there was talk about one of them being the vice presidential running mate for Hillary Clinton. So a friend of mine from law school emailed me and was like, so what have you done lately? Right? Are you up for vice president? And we were like, no, I don't think so. I have just a regular, boring job. But the thing that was really interesting about having famous classmates, and I have classmates who are in the state legislature in Kansas, the state legislature in Missouri, in New Jersey, just sort of all over the place, is that I feel like I know people everywhere, right? I feel like I have a connection with places that I would never have known anything about, right? Like I've never been to Arkansas. I don't really know anything about Arkansas, but my good friend Stuart is from Arkansas, and so, I feel like I know something about Arkansas. So I went to law school with no plan, right? I had no plan for the end. What was I gonna do? Where was I gonna live? What kind of a job would I have? What was my career goal? I literally had no plan. I got to the job part of law school where you start interviewing, and I did what pretty much everybody else did, and I interviewed for jobs, and I got one in Washington, D.C. with a big law firm. It's called Latham Watkins. It's a global behemoth law firm. And I thought, I'm just going to start there and see where things go because I don't know what I want to do. And a quick story about people you run into that you knew before. When I went to interview for the job in Washington, D.C., you go and you interview in the office, and they have, you interview with various people that work there. And I go into the office and I sit down, and it's one of the law clerks from the Utah Supreme Court that I had worked with when I was at the library. So this is, 3 or 4 years later, and he says, hey, I remember you, right? I'm like, I remember you, how great to see you, And it was really nice to have a personal connection with someone who worked there. Which I'm sure was a positive in the job, right? I got it, so he didn't hate me, obviously. But it also was nice to have someone who I could ask, I think, real questions to and know that I would get a real answer. I wasn't getting the sell like I might have from other people. So it was great to meet him. So I went to Washington, D.C., and I worked there for 3 years. And the reason I left Washington, D.C. has nothing to do with me, but I am married, and my husband is a physician, and he was in medical school in Washington, D.C., and when you are done with medical school, you go to a residency. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but it's like a giant match program, and you put your choices into the computer, and they put their choices in, and it does its magic, and you go to this giant assembly type thing, and they hand out the letter to everyone, and all across the country at the exact same time on the exact same day, they say, open. And you open the envelope, and at the very top corner, it says the name of the program and the city it's in. And that's where you're going for your residency. So I was basically along for the ride. And this is why I say sometimes you just look at where opportunity takes you, right? I had to, well, I guess I didn't have to go, but I had to go wherever he was going for residency. So he got a position in Phoenix, Arizona at a county hospital. He's an emergency physician, so he wanted to train at a county hospital. Great, let's go back west. I know nothing about Phoenix, Arizona. I know nobody in Phoenix, Arizona, right? So how am I gonna get a job in Phoenix, Arizona? So one of the people I work with says to me, you know, I did a summer job in Phoenix when I was in law school. Let me call the people that I worked with and have them, you know, get you in touch with them. So he makes a phone call, and within days, I get a call from the person there who says, hey, I hear you're moving out to Phoenix. We would love to have you. You know, if you're anything like this guy, you know, we're gonna hire you on the spot. I'm like, wow, who are you? Like, I don't even know who these people are. But I go out to Phoenix and I do some interviews, and that's actually the firm I ended up at. And I think obviously that initial connection couldn't have hurt me and certainly helped. So I go out to Phoenix and I work in another big law firm, and the type of law I do is general commercial complex litigation. So I'm in court, you know, dealing with disputes mainly between companies, big business. They're complex, they're large, but there's no specific nature to them. They're just business disputes, complex litigation. So I enjoyed that work, but the truth of the work is that it's really relentless. So law firms are big places. There's a lot of work to be had. There's a lot of long hours. This is before iPhones and smartphones, so they couldn't email you or call you at, you know, hours after you were there, and it was still a very, you know, busy, demanding kind of job. And so as my husband was finishing up his residency and we were looking at, okay, now that he's gonna get a job, where is it we want to be and what is it we want to do? So this is kind of the first part I will say in my career when it felt like I had a choice, right? Like I was actually making a decision about what I wanted to do. The rest of the ones were sort of choices by circumstance, right? I had to move here, I had to do this, and I was making choices kind of within that realm. But this was the first time where neither of us had to go anywhere, and we were just thinking, what is it we want to do? What is it we enjoy? Where do we want to live, right? So we put out feelers, start looking at places, and ultimately my husband actually got a job first here in Salt Lake City with IHC and their hospitals. So he was really excited about that. We were excited to move back home, be with our mountains that we had missed, get back to skiing on the weekends and that sort of thing. And so I said, okay, we're gonna go back to Salt Lake. What is it I really want to do? Like, what do I want to do with my career? Because at 6 years out of law school, you're at a point where you really have to make a critical decision. If you're going to go into private practice, you have to get in and start working towards making partner and start bringing a book of business with you. Or is there something else that I want to do? So I have always been interested, I would say, in government service. I always enjoyed studying government and looking at government. And when I was in private practice in Washington, I worked on the other side of some Department of Justice investigations. And I thought the type of work they do is really interesting. The hours are gonna be way better. The pay, of course, is not so great. But I had to make a decision about what I wanted to do with my career. And so I started making some phone calls. And one of my friends from law school was working at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I talked to him and said, hey, we're gonna be moving back to Salt Lake. Do you think there's any openings here? And he said, you know, I actually think there might be one. Let me, you know, get back to you. And so it turned out that there was an opening at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And they said, well, why don't you come up and meet with us? And so I flew up from Phoenix in January, which by the way was like terrible timing. You want to be in Arizona in January, not in Salt Lake. But I came up and met with the people there, and they said, you know, we'd love to have you apply. But this is a federal government job, so we're going to post the job. It has to be open for this many days. You have to apply like everybody else. You know, make sure you get everything right on your resume, or you'll get rejected by the system. And all this crazy stuff. So I was like, ooh, okay. But I did that, and you know, for me, it worked out, and I was able to get hired on at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I started working there a couple of months later. And the type of work I did there, so the U.S. Attorney's Office is the law firm, basically, for the federal government. So anytime the federal government brings a lawsuit in a state or defends a lawsuit that's been filed against the government in that state, it's almost always the U.S. Attorney's Office that represents them. So there's two big divisions in the U.S. Attorney's Office. The criminal division that prosecutes, tax fraud, white collar, violent crime, that kind of thing. And then there's the civil division, which does prosecutions when money's at issue, not putting people in jail, and then defending against lawsuits. So I was put into the civil division, which was great because it was the kind of cases I had done. I'd been a litigator, I had been to court, that's the kind of work I had done. And it was a really great experience. It was not specific in any way. So a lot of people go into law and kind of micro specialize. I do oil and gas antitrust. I do environmental analysis. I do corporate mergers and acquisitions for these types of companies. Something that's really a specific area. But at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you name it, it was our case, right? So some examples are a car accident with a postal truck, right? So somebody was injured in a car accident with a postal truck and they sued. So we represent the Postal Service. So that's just your typical personal injury. We have a lot of national parks in Utah and people get hurt in them a lot. People fall off things, people trip into things, rocks fall off things and hit people. There's just a lot of interaction, shall we say, between the environment and people in national parks. So sometimes those people sue the government for whatever reason, and we would defend those cases. There are cases where people challenge government regulations. So we had challenges to Medicare regulations. In Utah, we get a lot of challenge to environmental regulations, a lot of action by the Forest Service or the BLM, and any kind of action taken by a federal agency that was challenged in Utah. We did employment litigation, so any federal employee who felt they were discriminated against could file their lawsuit against the agency here in Utah, and we would defend those cases. So really a lot of everything across the board in terms of subject matter, but what it all had in common was that it was litigation, right? It was all trial work. We did appeals as well, but it was all litigation based. And so it was really a skill set that I had developed in private practice that I used in government. And it was actually quite fun. Every time a new case came in, I had to learn something new. So I had a trial about a canal, a canal in Heber City. So I had to learn about the Canal Act of 1890, right? Hadn't heard of the Canal Act of 1890 before that case, right? Have you heard of the Canal Act of 1890? Probably not, right? So really interesting case. We're at the archives looking for maps from 1905, right? Really interesting case. I learned about skid steer, track hoe, backhoe, the difference between the construction equipment used to maintain the canal. We went on a field trip to the canal. I mean, really interesting case, right? I had no knowledge about any of this before the case, nor have I really used it since, but it's interesting nonetheless, right? I know what a skid steer is, so my kids thought that was cool. But it was a really interesting job. I got to interact with a lot of great people who were employees of various federal agencies across the country, because it wasn't just people in Utah that were involved. We had to deal with higher up managers, say for the Forest Service, so people from DC, people from California who were higher up supervisors of people here in Utah. So it was a really interesting job. I enjoyed it. And it was a great place to work from a work-life balance perspective, right? So it's very much a regular 40-hour-a-week job, almost all the time. Now, if you went to trial, which we did a few times, then all bets are off, right? You have to work overtime, essentially, weekends, nights, preparing for trial, getting ready for the witness the next day. But they were short periods of time, 2 weeks here or there. But as a general matter, I went to work the same time every day. I left work the same time every day. I wasn't going to work weekends. I wasn't going to be working at night. And it made for a really nice work-life balance. It's very predictable. Law firm life for an attorney is not predictable because you never know when something's an emergency, when a client's going to call. No client was calling me at 9 p.m. to do something because they're not at work either, because they're government employees, right, who work at a different agency. So that was really nice. The other part of it that was really nice is that as the government, you have the ability to litigate a case to trial, whereas companies have different economic pressures, right? So when a company is sued, they look at a case and they think, okay, how much is it going to cost me in attorney's fees to litigate this case if we went to trial? Versus how much would we settle it for just to have it done and resolved? And there's a clear cost-benefit analysis there. There's a clear point at which it becomes more expensive to litigate the case than it is to settle, resolve it, and have everyone go their own way. The government has a different economic analysis, right? So I don't get paid extra because this case is going to trial. The Forest Service isn't paying me because they have a case, right? I'm free to them. We're just a service that's provided. And so really the economic analysis is different. It's just I'm working on one case versus another case. And is that a good use of resources of the office? But what it does allow the government to do is to take a more significant look at the merits of the claim and decide if it's a case that ought to be decided on the merits by a judge or a jury, as opposed to one that needs to be settled because of the economic circumstances. And so as a litigator, that was great for me because I think the latest statistic is that of all the cases filed in federal court, 1.2% actually go to a trial and are resolved by a judge or a jury after a trial. So almost all of them are resolved either by settlement, agreement of the parties, or one side or the other wins on a motion or a procedural matter, before it gets that far. So as a litigator and someone who enjoys being in court, that's what was really nice for me, is that we had an opportunity to have more experience in court because we didn't have the same pressures as businesses did in deciding how to treat cases. So I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office for 9 years. I had no plans to go anywhere. In Utah, it's one of the best jobs I think you could have as a lawyer. I loved it. Maybe law professors equally as good. I don't know. I haven't been on that side, but great job. Really enjoyed it. Like I said, no plans to go anywhere. And then one day the phone rang. And it was a friend of mine that I had known in Washington, D.C. More than 10 years earlier. And he said, hey, I'm here at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Utah. And I knew he was. We kind of kept tabs, but I wasn't a close friend, not somebody I was going out to lunch with all the time. But, we kept tabs. And I said, yeah, I know you're at the SEC. How's it going? And he said, great. We have an opening for a trial attorney. I thought of you. Maybe you'd like to apply. We'd love to have you apply. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I knew there was an SEC office. I knew he was here. But the thought had really not been on my mind of looking to move jobs. And so after I talked to him the first time, I thought, this is really interesting. So at this point, I was 15 years into my legal career. I'd been doing the same job for the last 9, and I thought, do I want to make a change, right? Do I want to shift what I'm doing, at least in some part, right? It was still trial work, but a different subject matter. Is that something I want to think about doing at this point in my career? And, after thinking about it, I said to myself, this is an opportunity and I should just see where it goes, right? There's no harm in applying because, who knows how it's going to end up, but it's an interesting idea and something that I should pursue. I think I would like it. But because I wasn't looking for it, it's not like it was my dream job, right? It's not like I said, oh, that's the job that 20 years ago I decided I was going to have. So I went through the application process and learned more about the office there and ultimately was offered the job, which I'm very grateful for. It was a very lucky thing for me. And I decided that I would accept the job because I thought, this is a really good opportunity for me. I get to stay in Salt Lake City, which was important for my family. I get to stay with the federal government, which is important for benefits and health insurance and retirement and all of these fun things that you start to think about. And I thought, really, this is a win-win for me because I'm not going very far. I'm going a couple blocks down the street to a different office. And I knew I would still see my colleagues that I enjoyed working with, and I would have a new challenge. And I do, and I love it. So let me tell you a little bit about what we do at the SEC. Does anybody here know what the SEC does? Have you heard of the SEC other than the football conference? We get confused with that a lot. Because if you type in SEC, you'll either pull up, like Florida football or the Securities and Exchange Commission. So the Securities and Exchange Commission was created after the 1929 market crash through some legislation in the 30s. And our job is to regulate the markets and to enforce the anti-fraud laws that were included as part of those acts. So I'm in the Division of Enforcement, which is a big hint about what I do. So we enforce the laws, we bring the actions to go after the people who have violated the securities laws. There's a whole arm of the Securities and Exchange Commission that deals with like corporate filings, 10K, 8K, if any of you invest in the stock market, these kinds of things. That's not what we do, that's the other side of the SEC, but they do the regulatory piece to keep the corporations, keeping the market informed about them and releasing the information that they're required to. So the kinds of cases we bring are really fun for me. So I kind of feel like a detective, right? So we're doing financial fraud, right? So you think financial fraud, that sounds really boring. So think Ponzi scheme. Does anybody know what a Ponzi scheme is? Okay, so Ponzi scheme is when you have an investment of some kind and your money's brought in, and then they keep bringing in new investors, and the money from the new investors goes to pay the old investors because there's not really a product there. There's not really an investment, right? It's just a big circle of money. So the new money comes in and pays the old people, and eventually the whole thing collapses because there's just not enough new money to come in to meet the obligations of the Ponzi scheme. So I started at the SEC on a Monday. And on Wednesday, 2 days later, I was in court filing for a temporary restraining order and an asset freeze in a Ponzi scheme case. So we go in as the SEC sometimes on an emergency basis if we have a fraud that's ongoing that we want to halt. And we have two ways we do that. So a temporary restraining order is a court order that says you must stop this conduct. You may no longer engage in this behavior. And then an asset freeze is what it sounds like. We come in and we literally freeze all of the assets of the company or the individual or both, depending on the type of case. That means you can't move them, you can't sell them, you can't access them. We freeze them. And the reason we do that is we want to make sure we preserve for all of the aggrieved investor victims as much money as we can so that at the end they're able to get some money back, because there's never all the money there, right? We hope we get into the Ponzi scheme before it's totally collapsed, but oftentimes the reason people call us is because they're not getting their money. So this case is a particularly interesting case, I think at least. I don't know, you tell me if you think it's interesting, but we have a gentleman whose name was Roger Bliss, and he was out of Bountiful, Utah, and he ran what he called an investment club, the Bliss Club. And you gave him your money, and he would pool it with the other investors in the club. And depending on who you were, the club had 5 or 10 members in it. He had a different story. And he would day trade your money, and he would only trade Apple stock, right? So everybody knows Apple stock. He was so good, he never lost money. So at the end of every trading day, he was ahead. He might have lost a little in the middle, but he never lost at the end of the day. His returns, he told folks, were between 100% and 600%. Right? So amazing returns on trading Apple stock. I see a few people shaking their heads. Sounds a little too good to be true. Keep that in mind. And he was so generous, he'd split the profits with you 50-50. So he signed a document that guaranteed your principal not at risk. It's covered. You're not going to lose any money you put with me. And anything you make, which is going to be a lot, we'll split 50-50. So he had a lot of money come in. We later learned it was $26 million that people invested with him. And that's a lot of money. And where did he get this money, you ask? From his friends, from his neighbors, from the members of his church, from their family members, from a few strangers to him, but they were friends of people already in or family members of people already in, right? That's how they spread. They start with people you know, family and friends, church members, neighbors, and then it always works at the beginning, right? So those people saw on the website that he set up where he would report your returns, wow, I have made huge returns. I have made millions of dollars in short order. This is the best thing ever. I tell my family about it. I tell my friends about it. See if you can get in on this. This is amazing. Turns out it's not so amazing. So of the $26 million that came in, and there were about 150 investors, so way more than the 5 to 10 he was telling people. So of the $26 million that came in, $16 million was used in what we call Ponzi payments. So he just churned the money back out to investors. So you would see the money hit the bank account on Monday, say it was $100,000. Then you'd see 5 checks sent out to 5 different investors, 20,000 each, the 100,000's gone, right? Never even gets invested in anything. It's just used to pay the previous investors. So that leaves 10 million. So we know where 16 million went back to investors. Now, it didn't all go back to the people who put the money in, so we'll come back to that. But the 10 million, where did the 10 million go, you say? Well, he lost $3.5 million actually trading Apple stock. So not all of the money made it to the trading account, but some did. And the money that did go there, he lost a lot of. So he just lost $3.5 million in trading losses. So that $3.5 million is just gone. So that leaves $6.5 million. Well, where'd that go? You think, well, surely he bought something, right? Something of value. So he did. He had a beach house on Bear Lake, or lake house, whatever you want to call it, at Bear Lake. He was building a garage next to it. I say garage. It was a garage, but it was as big as the house. So it was a garage for all the stuff to go in it. He had a house in Bountiful that he had bought. He had the original house he'd lived in the Mill Creek area in Salt Lake. And then he had a bunch of cars and toys. So snowmobiles, sailboat, ATVs, a bunch of cars. So all of that's been liquidated, but it doesn't add up to $6.5 million. He gave away maybe $1 million, a little less, to family members. Just wrote them checks every month. Here you go. Paid for his kids' tuition, daily expenses, gas, whatever else. Basically just spent the rest of the money on stuff, for lack of a better word. Stuff that you can't turn into an asset, right? Stuff that isn't an asset to sell, that can be liquidated to return to investors. So Mr. Bliss was also prosecuted criminally. So the Utah Attorney General's office took the case, and he ended up pleading guilty to the criminal charges. And he was sentenced earlier this year to a term of 4 to 30 years in state prison. And in the state system, the way it works is after you're sentenced, they give you the range. You have a hearing with the parole board. I don't know if it's 6 months in or something like that in. And the parole board sets your initial parole hearing to see if you'll be released. So he had a minimum of 4, maximum 30. The parole board set his hearing, and it's in 2026. So he has a 10-year sentence that he will serve before he's eligible for parole, and they'll decide then, what it is. So what are we doing with all of his stuff, right? How are we trying to get it back to victims? So we asked the court to appoint what's called a receiver. So this is a third party that comes in and they take charge of everything. They take all the assets, they inventory them, they sell them, they do all of that. And they also decide if there's anybody they need to sue who benefited from the Ponzi scheme. So this is where I go back to the folks who were early investors in the scheme. So say you put in $100,000 and you were taking back payments every month of $10,000 because you thought you had lots of money. You thought you had $5 million. So you get $10,000 a month. And then when the SEC comes in and we shut it down, you'd put in $100,000, but you'd gotten back $150, right? So you think that $50,000 is this great trading gains that have been made. And the reality is it's just somebody else's money. So it needs to be returned to the estate because it's not your money. So the receiver then decides how to get that money back. She can do a lot of different things. She can ultimately sue people to get that money back. So in any Ponzi scheme, you're going to have people who we call net winners. And most of the time, they're victims as well. They didn't know it was a fraud. They didn't intend to receive other people's money. And so you essentially create victims out of everyone, even the people who didn't lose money. The people who made money also are victims of the fraud, because now they have to come up with the money to pay it back. And then the victims who lost all of their money, right, they hope to get some money back. Now that case is still underway. We don't know how much money is going to be returned to the investors, but it certainly won't be the full money that they're owed, because there just weren't that many assets available to pay them back. And so we have investors in that case who have drained their 401k account and put all of their money in with Mr. Bliss and have lost it all and now have no retirement funds at all. We have people who invested their life savings. We have people who invested inheritances they received. There's a lot of people who were victimized here who are going to suffer the financial losses for years to come. And that's why we hope we get in before the Ponzi scheme goes too far. And this is where I'll plug our Whistleblower Program. So a few years ago, the SEC was able to start a whistleblower program under some legislation passed in Congress. And it's hopefully an incentive for people to give us tips and complaints about things they see that might be a fraud. So for instance, if you were a neighbor of Mr. Bliss and you had heard his pitch and you thought, that sounds a little strange, maybe like it couldn't be true, you could file a whistleblower complaint with the SEC at just sec.gov. You can go do it online, and we will look at all of those. We will look at all of the complaints that come in and see if there is some action that we need to take. And there's a financial incentive for you to do so. So there's a few criteria you have to meet, but if we have a successful prosecution of an individual or company where there's a whistleblower complaint and we get a judgment, a money judgment, and again, there's a few criteria, you can get a percentage award. And the award doesn't come from the funds for the victims. There's a separate whistleblower account that was created. So on Monday of this week, we announced the payment of a $20 million whistleblower award in a case. So $20 million just to the one whistleblower. So it's not insignificant. Now we have much smaller awards as well, but since the inception of the program, we've awarded more than $100 million to whistleblowers. So something to think about just as you're out and about in the world is to have a cautious eye and listen carefully. And if you see something or hear about something that you think might violate the securities laws, you can always file a whistleblower complaint, and there might be a positive financial benefit for you down the road. It's a great program and one we're really happy to see, because our goal would be to get in and shut down the Ponzi scheme before it runs out of money, because then we have more money to give back. So that's essentially what I do now. That's kind of how I got where I am. We have some time left for questions. Can I answer questions of anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
So when you were in the bigger law firm, how conducive was that to the family life?
Yeah, so I like to tell this story. My husband was in medical school when I was in law school, and we did not have children yet, so keep that in mind. I had a cell phone, but it was like an old Nokia phone, so go back because it's been a while. My cell phone rang in the morning, and I answered it and said hello, and it was him, and he said, "Hey, where are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm in Nashville." I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "I just got off call, so I'm at home." And I was like, "Oh, that's great. I'll be home tomorrow night." I think this was a Thursday. I'll be home tomorrow night. He's like, "Oh, that's too bad. I'm on call again tomorrow night. Where are you going to be home for the weekend?" And I said, "No, I have to fly back to Nashville on Sunday." And he said, "Okay, well, I get off call on Saturday night, so maybe we could meet for dinner." And I was like, "Well, that'd be great." So we go to dinner by the hospital where he was doing a rotation, and he got paged in the middle of dinner. So it's like, "Well, it was great to see you. I'm going to be gone all next week. So will I see you next weekend?" He's like, "I think I'm back on call next weekend, but I can't remember my schedule." And I was like, "Okay, we'll just figure it out later." That was pretty typical of my work schedule. So I traveled quite a bit for my job. We had clients in a couple places where we had a big case where I would travel. My sister, who lived here at the time, so 2-hour time difference, would call me when she got off work at 5 or 5:30, and she would call my office in DC where it was 7 or 7:30 because she knew that's where I would be. Because I didn't leave the office before about 8 o'clock. So it's a lot of time commitment. It's a lot of hours of work. I worked most weekends, not everyone, but most. I rarely was home before 8 o'clock at night, and I traveled a lot. So I made the decision after 6 years of private practice that it wasn't conducive to the family life I wanted. Now, there are certainly people who do it and are happy doing it and enjoy the work and the lifestyle. You just have to understand what that looks like. And for me, that wasn't the kind of lifestyle I wanted to have. And so in government, the thing I really enjoy is I get to do very exciting legal work. The securities prosecutions are very fun, very interesting, engaging, but I don't have to do it every night and on the weekends. I can do it in a much more manageable amount of time. But like I said, everyone has to make that decision for themselves, and there are certainly lots of people who work in firms and like it. There, I'm sure, are people who work in firms and don't like it too. But that's probably the case with every job. So, other questions? Yeah.
Are you mostly involved with Ponzi schemes, or is there insider trading? And what are some of the other things that you go after?
Yeah, so we had an insider trading case last year that we filed in the Southern District of New York. So it was filed in New York City. And it was a very interesting insider trading case because it was a Chilean national who was on the board of a Chilean company who we alleged traded in advance of the public release of information about a potential merger and acquisition of that Chilean company. So it had some really interesting legal issues because the shares were ultimately brought to the United States in a format that I won't bore you with, but there were certainly some questions about the jurisdiction of the SEC, of the facts of that case. But it was a really interesting case. We ultimately settled the case, and I believe it was $13.6 million that the individual paid to settle the insider trading charges. So we do have those. Offering fraud, which is essentially a Ponzi scheme, is something we see a lot of. I've filed two, well, I had one and the other attorney in my office had the other. We had two Ponzi scheme cases we filed this year here in Utah. We also cover other states. I've cases in Idaho and Nevada. I also had a case in South Carolina. You know, we kind of go wherever the cases take us. We do accounting fraud. Those aren't as interesting to most, folks who aren't in the industry. We also have Foreign Corrupt Practice Act cases. So there actually was a big press today about a settlement with JP Morgan about violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that we enforce. This is about making payments to foreign officials, essentially a bribery kind of case. So you can, if you Google JP Morgan, you'll find that today. It was in the headlines. So there's lots of different cases, but offering fraud is kind of our the bread and butter that never seems to go away. Yeah.
I'm curious, what are these, as you've got to know some of the people that you're suing in the Ponzi schemes, what are they thinking about what their exit strategy is? This guy you were talking about was buying land locally. I mean, if I were to be a Ponzi scheme, I would have like a bank account in the Caymans and an open-ended ticket to somewhere without an extradition treaty with the U.S., right? I mean, you'd think that at any moment gonna go down and I gotta cash out and be out of here quickly, but they don't seem to be thinking longer term.
So our experience is that they don't think long term at all. They don't have an exit strategy, and I suspect it's because they don't think it will end. I don't know that, but we haven't really seen people that have an exit strategy, right? So when you think about this rationally, right, you think, okay, I'm gonna put the money here where they can't get it. When we get, here's my my runaway money number, right? If I hit this number, I'm good. I'm gonna head out, right, and live my life on the beach. They don't seem to do that. I don't know why it is, but my best guess is they think it's such a great thing they've got going that they don't want to stop it, right? Because if you run, right, if you move out of the States, then you have to stop the scheme, and I don't know if that's sort of just a compulsion that they can't stop it, or that they've made a calculation that they don't want to. But you're right, there doesn't ever seem to be. Mm-hmm.
In addition to being like corrupt, I mean,
Right.
maybe if they can convince themselves that they can stay in it forever, do they convince themselves also that there's nothing really wrong with it?
Some of them do. Yeah, absolutely. They deny that there was ever anything wrong. We just don't understand it. Right? If they could just explain it to us again, we would understand it and understand how it's not a Ponzi scheme. We get that quite a bit. So that I definitely think there are people who become their own true believer, and so they don't see the need for an exit strategy. And then there certainly are the ones who are just more pathologic about it, and it's just a fraud from the get-go. Yeah. It would be interesting to study for like the psychology side, right? What the mindset is there. Yeah.
I'm assuming there aren't that many with an exit strategy, but if somebody did, do y'all still go after them, or is it, oh dang, they ran off to Cayman and you can't get to it, we're toast?
Right, so we would do whatever we could to reach the person and their assets, right? So depending on where they go, we have treaties and agreements with various nations. Some nations are known as safe harbors because, you know, we're unable to get cooperation from their governments in bringing assets back. So, you know, depending on where they go, will depend on how we're able to get assets back. But we would never just say, oh, they left the U.S., never mind. You know, we would take every effort we could to get them or their funds back to the United States. Yeah, go ahead.
Have you ever had to deal with like cryptocurrency or
Like Bitcoins and...
like, it seems like a good way to set up a Ponzi scheme, like people say, oh, this is a cryptocurrency. Like,
So I will say I haven't had a case like that, but technology is certainly evolving. And the Ponzi scheme, I mean, it's named after a guy whose last name was Ponzi from the 30s, I think, the 20s or the 30s. So the idea is very old, right? But what we're seeing are new ways to effectuate the scheme using technology, right? You can doctor statements a lot better now. You used to have to like cut and paste on paper and make Xerox copies, and now with a computer you can make it look as good as the original. And you know, technology gives a lot more opportunities for fraud. As great as technology is and everything it brings, it also brings with it opportunities for people who don't have good motives. And so I think there's always something new on the horizon that has to do with the technology that we're seeing. Social media, for instance, now is a great way to reach a lot of people, which you can do for good or maybe not so good, right? So there's a lot of ways that people are using the new technology, the internet, to keep their scheme going and get it off the ground.
so like with cryptocurrency, like how would that work with jurisdiction? Like, because it's not necessarily in a particular jurisdiction. Like, have you heard of Ethereum?
I haven't. So the way jurisdiction works for us is there needs to be some connection with the United States, right? So U.S. There's a lot of complicated legal analysis that goes on there, but you know, we don't have jurisdiction for things in other countries that happen. You know, we don't have jurisdiction just because we're the U.S. and we say we do. Right.
If the users have been replaced, then
Right.
the owner of the site is somewhere else. It's
I will agree that it does get complicated, and we, when we do bring cases under those circumstances, oftentimes the jurisdiction for us to do so is challenged. And we have a case right now where that is true. They have challenged our jurisdiction to bring the case, and it involves an internet Ponzi scheme. So it's definitely something that we're dealing with and facing, and you know, as these become broader, more global reach with the internet and everything else, it's definitely a challenge. Yeah. Great. And one other?
Yes, you mentioned about this gentleman in Mill Creek and the downfall, that some of the people, some of these investors, so to speak, in this Ponzi scheme were board members, I believe you said. Do you see, I don't know if you have statistical data on this, but do you seem to see a greater susceptibility to those kinds of schemes up and down the kind of the Wasatch Front?
So there's a term for it. It's called affinity fraud. So, and the affinity could be anything. Typically, it's a community to which you belong, right? And then the fraudster uses those connections within that community and the trust you have within that community for your shared values or your shared characteristics to exploit that. So it happens certainly within the LDS community, and we see that here in Utah. We saw it in the Bliss case. It's happened in the Jewish community. it's happened in non-religious communities. We had a case a number of years ago that affected the deaf community, and there was a big fraud that was perpetrated on a lot of members of the deaf community. And what they're doing is exposing the members of that community to their fraud through the lens of that community. So you have a natural inclination to trust them more than you would a stranger off the street because they're a member of your community or they're connected in some way to your community. And so people tend to be less maybe critical of the idea or trust it more or tend to believe it more, and so it makes them more willing to do something that maybe they wouldn't do with a total stranger, which is why we tell people who are thinking of investing in something that you should check out the investment and you should check out the person doing the investment, whether you know them or not, right? Whether they're someone in your neighborhood or who goes to your church or a friend of a family member, you should do the same diligence and background work with them as you would with anybody else, because just because you know them or they're a member of your same community doesn't mean the investment is any more safe or better than any other. But it is a problem. It does happen a lot across the country. We certainly see it here. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks.